Right, so I'm going to walk you through the mix for this one. I'll start with the guitars. Quite a lot of processing, but I'll turn it all off and just listen to a guitar in solo. So I used my plugin, 5150 block letter, and I used a impulse response from my impulse response pack, which is a Marshall speaker, a top right speaker, vintage 30, and it's one of the more darker impulse responses. So this is how that guitar sounds. These are the settings. And as you can see here, I'm just using just this one impulse response that I've loaded in. Cool, so that's one of the guitars. I do have a C4 multiband compressor working on the palm mutes. So there's a left and right of those guitars, and then two quieter tracks which are panned 85% left and right, and they're around 10 dB quieter. It says -9, but they're not necessarily the same level, different settings. So 5150 again. This is the sound for that one, and this is an impulse response, cab 1, top left, position 4. And as you can see, it's 100% on this one. Cool, so all my guitars go to the guitar group, and they all get treated and EQ'd together. So even though I've got this multiband compressor on the guitars individually, I've still got it on the guitar group, just because you never can have enough taming of some of those palm mutes. And that's what that looks like. So up next, I'm doing a lot of filtering out all the horrible whistly frequencies, and there's a ton in this area. And because I'm cutting so much stuff out up here, and because some of it's quite drastic and it's all in a very confined area, I'm boosting again after this. And I'd rather, the reason I do it on multiple different EQs as opposed to just do all my EQing within one is I just feel like it's cleaner and easier to sort of make sense. So this is like my subtracting EQ, where I'm finding problematic woomphy low end or cab whistly or really high end harsh whistly peaks that I want to get rid of. And then I'm going to go in and boost some high end, because essentially this is going to be the main area of your tone that's going to stand out in the mix. This is where your high end of your guitars exists. And if it's got a lot of harsh junk, you can't really boost it and have it loud in the mix if it's full of like horrible whistling stuff. So let's loop the riff. I can talk about it from left to right. So this is doing even more of what the C4 compressor is doing. Same with this area. So I'm carving it out. So I am EQing that area out, but it is also acting dynamically with, accidentally changing the values there, with the responding to like the low end and how that's moving. This is a sort of standard-ish area. So between 650 and like 715 is, depends on the cab tone you've got, but this is normally where you get that sort of like whistle. Definitely comes through quite a lot with a 5150. And then this whole area of harshness, so 2.2, 2.3 is really like harsh and horrible normally. That's kind of standard for a lot of like vintage 30 cab sounds. Same with like 2.9, 2.8. And 3.2, yep, that's another like prominent peak in most of my cabs. Then yeah, we've got 3.8 here. 4.3 can be bad if you're using like a Sennheiser 421 microphone, and 4.7 is normally just the problem area. Now this is more just taming, even though I've gone for relatively dark impulse responses, this area I just don't like hearing a lot of 6K in my guitar tones, and I'm going to boost some high end above 6K, so I don't really want to be bringing any more 6K up when I do some boosting. So up next I've got Soothe running, which I don't normally like to rely on to just sort of shave off any of the harshness. This is again almost like a dynamic EQ kind of thing. It's really easy to abuse this plugin. I tend to use this mostly on overheads, which can be like really harsh. Cool, so up next, got the SSL style EQ. So I'm boosting at 14K by 6 dB. And then coming in at 3.3 with 3.2 dB. And then this value, or this pot value here, doesn't necessarily always line up with exactly with what it says when you look at it on FabFilter. So if I go in, I'll open up a new FabFilter here, EQ, and if I make a really narrow cut, the cut is like around 950 there, even though it's showing 1.3. And you can see the cut is happening around 360 there, but it's showing 8.7. So yeah. So I'm just kind of trying to get like a broad mid-range cut with this one. Sounds really cardboardy when you put it back in. And I'm boosting some sub low end, sort of like, would you call it sub? I guess so, around 60 Hertz. And then I've got one more instance of FabFilter, just sort of taming anything again. So I've got my high pass here to around 70. I've got a low pass to around 14. I don't really need to tame too much of the high end because it's not too fizzy there. And then I was finding this was like sticking its head out a bit too much. And then just a few other sort of mid-range cuts. And that's it for the guitars. And for bass, I'm using nocturnal bass for this one. And I've got the position up quite high because I didn't want it to trigger off any of like the lower frets for like a more tinny thin sound. I wanted it to sound a bit thicker for these riffs. So the processing on that, starting with FabFilter Pro MB. Just kind of locking every area down for that, and then doing a similar thing with some dynamic EQ here to tame this area. And then compressing it. So I'm obviously using the DI sound from Nocturnal Bass. So compressor here, fast release is usually backwards on these 1176 style ones. Could go a little bit quicker on the attack. Then I'm using the Dark Glass Ultra. The settings, I normally kind of go 100% on the blend. Sort of dial it in how I want it to sound, and then providing the sort of quote unquote DI sound is decent, I'll put a bit more of it back in. Then we've got some EQ here. I found there wasn't enough like subby low end, and I was taking out what was building up in the more kind of woomphy low end. Usually cut anywhere between like 350 to 500 on bass. Depending on the bass tone you're going for and the tuning that you're in, you know, this kind of thing can change. I really like this kind of pokey frequency to like kind of hear the bass in the mix. Bit too extreme in terms of the whistle one I put up then, but yeah. I don't know if this area is like more of a cab thing as opposed to the bass itself on the dark glass. Probably is, and bringing up a bit sort of like 3K around there and a low pass. Then I limit bass always, but I don't really like to go too extreme. The more you limit bass, the more kind of subby low end you kind of lose, and then more EQ just to kind of tame things even more. So I've got a high pass to around 50. More dynamic EQ to stop anything getting too like built up in that area. This area was definitely like a pretty harsh whistle. To be honest, sometimes with bass you can like leave those kind of harsh frequencies in a bit more, and like you just end up hearing the bass a bit more in the mix, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I obviously found it too annoying when I was listening to this demo over and over again. And is there any more EQ? Yep, even more dynamic EQ to really make sure that the low end is locked down. So as you can see, this is all dynamic EQ. And ignore that because that's not on. So that is the bass. And then for the drums, I think I just worked off the default kit. So it's the Gretsch mid-tuning snare. I've got a lot of the overhead mic, which sounds like this. You can hear the reverb on that. I might have ever so slightly dropped the pitch, barely even noticeable to be honest. So I swapped the kick on the default kit out for the Q 24-inch resonant head off. Sounds like that. Brought, I think, the room mics down on the cymbals, so I just selected the length function and just, I think they're normally up here, and I just brought them down a bit so the cymbals are a little bit more focused. There's a good amount of roominess though with the snare, and a fair amount still in there with the toms. So these are the tom room mics. And what else have I done? I brought the hi-hat down. I've programmed the hi-hat quite loud, like I think I feel like the quote-unquote verse riff, I just put it at 127 velocity. So if you went for a bit more of a lighter programming on the hi-hat, so not 127, you could get away with just leaving that a bit more up there. I think I was being lazy. I don't think a drummer would necessarily play their hi-hats, even on a slow groove like that, at the hardest velocity, but you can just play around with that sort of thing. Bump the china up a bit, and on the transient master, I definitely add more sustain to the china. Sometimes take a bit of the attack off, so you just get to purr in the mix a bit more, as opposed to just like a really short sort of sound. And overheads, yep, I think I've pushed the crashes up a bit more than the other cymbals, and brought the chinas down for some reason. And yeah, I think that's it. Pretty much just the default kit, nothing too crazy on that one. I think I've left the reverb. I don't think I touched the reverb. Yeah, pretty standard. And obviously you could play around with dropping in some one-shot samples. So if you go into the Files tab, and wherever you've saved the one-shot samples on your computer, you could drag in like a different kick drum to blend in with the quote-unquote real kick drum or the multi-sample. So this is just going to be a single hit, and we can have a play around with that now. So one thing you can do, obviously all of these close mic kick samples here on this fader, like the main kicks, multi-velocity layers, multi-sample at each velocity. I think there's usually around 7 different hits, and you never hear the same one in a row. But they are all super consistent sounding, and if you program it at just the hardest velocity and just leave them like that, they can still have that kind of almost trigger-like sound, which is what I wanted, because all my favorite mixes have really solid, consistent kick drum sounds. So this isn't something you need to do, but something that you can play around with, is use the low end from a sample, so tilt the EQ all the way to the left, and then use the high end from the quote-unquote real kick, which is going to have more variation to it. So you get a completely solid low end that doesn't change at all. I mean, having said that, there are one-shot samples blended in on some of the kick drums in the library, so you don't need to do this, but this is something you can do with. You can do this to create different kick sounds, and you can also experiment doing this if you're working with any real drums. Kind of use a trigger to keep the low end really consistent, or the high end, or both, and just use a bit more mid-range from your real kicks, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm going to try and just get like a Frankenstein different kick sound by using the low end of this one and the high end of this one. Actually, first thing I'm going to do is try and get them in phase or out of phase. Yeah, they're pretty much in phase then. Right. So let me do that low end and high end thing. Just a different sound, something you can just play around with to get even more sounds out of this library. So that's how that sounds versus if you just left this normally and had it like that. It's got a different characteristic on the low end on every kick sample, so you can get, different sounds. Then we can try loading in a different snare one-shot sample. So we could do, maybe blend in like the Gretsch mid-tuning one, that's a cool one. And just hear the snares close mics together. They're near enough in phase, I think, with each other. Cool, so that is how I mixed that one.